Okay, welcome to the HELSUS Global South Encounters with me, Franklin Obiodun, Associate Professor of Sustainability Science with Global Development Studies as the chair. India's reliance on coal evokes both nationalist and internationalist responses. At the national level, the Indian government takes the view that those who have been responsible for historical emissions should do more. India, its leaders contend, should be allowed to use a coal-based developmentalist model, just as many countries in the global north did, and indeed continue to do. The country's leaders contend that if the richer economies developed by burning coal, they have no moral authority to demand that the South should phase out its reliance on coal. If at all, a phase down is the more appropriate response. But internationally, a wide range of actors have condemned India. Northern environmentalists and mainstream economists find a strange alliance in which both question India's approach. The Economist even goes as far as to point out that India's strategy is a Faustian bargain, because in the long term, any fallout from climate change could fall disproportionately on Indians and others in the global South. To take this approach then is what the Economist calls, quote and unquote, cowardice. This critique of India's policy on coal sounds reasonable, perhaps even persuasive, but do the actions of the North constitute ecological imperialism nevertheless? Could the biggest historical emitters turn round to blame the victims for not doing enough? On the other hand, who really are the beneficiaries of India's coal-based developmentalist model? These are serious questions, but who can address them? André Gundar-Frank, the well-known proponent of the hypothesis that relationships between the strong and the weak, whether internal or external, disproportionately benefit the strong and impoverish the weak, also argued, and I quote, "Though science and truth know no national boundaries, it is probably new generations of scientists from the underdeveloped countries themselves who most need to and best can devote the necessary attention to these problems and clarify the process of underdevelopment and development," end of quote. This idea of internal imperialism in India and its external intersections with Australian coal has at last been developed by the Indian scholar activist Dr. Ruchira Talukdar, our speaker for today's Global South Encounters. Talukdar, a research associate at the Climate Justice Research Centre, University of Technology, Sydney in Australia, has been a voice of insight, reason, and action. Her PhD thesis compared coal conflicts and protest movements in India and Australia, with an emphasis on the intersections between grassroots and indigenous peoples' movements and mainstream environmental activism, concluding that Northern activists are indeed part of the problem. Her work within the environmental movement in India in Greenpeace and Australia in Greenpeace, Australian Conservation Foundation, and Friends of the Earth Australia for a decade and a half should leave no one in any doubts that she understands the realpolitik and science of coal. Needless to say, she has demonstrated, perhaps more than anyone else, the limitations of Northern environmentalism and the naivety of a simple South-North environmental rapprochement. Unlike many, she sees that the climate question is also a migrant question, a southern question, an intersectional question, a question for the whole world. But it cannot be addressed on terms imposed by the global North. Although a scholar par excellence, she has no time for detached theorizing and disengaged theories. She is on a mission to change the world. Accordingly, Talukdar has co-founded SABNA South Asian Climate Solidarity, an Australian-based South Asian environmental network to link South Asian migrant experiences of environment and climate change in Australia and South Asia, and to mentor the next generation of South Asian climate activists in Australia. But does she risk splitting and splintering the movement which she has helped to build by questioning what many in the movement might consider a fair bargain? Or is her argument about ecological imperialism the vital missing link in sustainability science and Northern climate justice movements? Welcome, Ruchira. Perhaps let's get into the substance of your research by beginning with your analysis, followed by questions and comments by all of us, and then you can respond. For the audience, our practice is to turn off our videos and mute our microphones while others have been given the virtual floor. But questions can be sent to me in the personalized chat box. So, Ruchira, you have the floor and the mic.
Thank you, Franklin, for such a generous and lofty introduction. I hope I can live up to the expectations. And thanks also for inviting me to both kind of write a paper in the special issue and also to present at Global South Encounters. And thank you also, Tia and Sophie, for the coordination and for generally having patience with me being slow about everything. So I'm going to share my screen, but I actually really like it when some people at least keep their videos on. Because then I can see faces, if that's okay. Just one person, great. Thank you, Franklin. And yes, a couple of you, it's great. So you can see my presentation, see my screen? Yeah, great.
Yes, yes.
Thanks so much, Franklin, for setting the context, because I think you have freed me from the need to kind of have really strong theoretical claims around what I'm doing. I do have a central line running through it. But what I really want to bring up here are very kind of oppositional elements and notions of climate justice that I work with, and then my thesis, which Franklin very generously introduced, works with. So I'm going to actually focus primarily on a conundrum that exists in the context of the Global South, which India epitomizes in a way. So basically what I'm going to do is start with a focus on India. I'm going to focus on the climate justice articulation of the Indian government, which is a post-colonial developmental justice argument. And I'm going to then also talk about civil society's climate justice argument. And I'm going to look at both of these, how they have changed over time, temporal analysis, which is basically framed within the political economy. So my work is based within the political ecology, political economy framework, and I essentially look at change in positions in politics over time. I'm also going to then link these the movements in the government's articulation of justice and civil society's articulation of justice with coal mining itself, because coal and development is sacred in the Southern context, in a post-colonial context. And I'm going to present 2 case studies to basically kind of, give you like a rich kind of empirical kind of taste and flavor of what's going on. And then I'm finally going to come to trying to basically tie these different concepts of climate justice together in some kind of a framework which centers the most critical justice elements together. What I'm really working with is a kind of carbon environmentalism. Apologies for not having kind of finished that quote. Carbon environmentalism emerging from the global north, a form of eco-imperialism, which is essentially about removing carbon-intensive sources and moving to renewables, which disregards much. I'm working with that, and I'm working with the fact that global South governments like India have an entrenched position of developmental justice. While there's the third space, which is the space that I looked at in my thesis very strongly, a third space which is true of indigenous resistances to fossil fuel, both in the global north and indigenous resistance to fossil fuels. I looked at coal specifically in India, in the global south. And therein, for me, lies an answer and a centrality to what should be framing a global climate justice movement. And it's a third dimension of climate justice, which should be at the center. So this is what frames my presentation today. And I'm going to attempt to kind of go through it fairly quickly so we can take a lot of questions, which then further tease, these ideas. So I'm going to start with an interesting kind of juxtaposition of two things that happened at Glasgow COP in November last year, is when India made, India made grandiose announcements about 50% renewables, 50% of its energy being sourced from renewable sources by 2030. It's not a new commitment. It had made similar commitments at Paris. It upped the number a little bit. India also disappointed, my quote unquotes are related to news headlines around the world, disappointed by the world by saying it's going to achieve net zero emissions by 2070 instead of 2050, which is stipulated as necessary. These are projections coming from what the Paris Agreement, kind of holds, and what the IPCC reports say are essential. India also, in the last round of negotiations on the very final day, along with some other countries, basically only agreed to phase down rather than phase out coal. Now, phasing out of coal is again what scientists mandate is required, to be able to contain global warming within 1.5 degrees. Phase out of coal, all coal by 2050. So while the Indian government and the Indian delegation was making, the kind of having these conversations inside the tent, outside, just for a little bit of context, India's, kind of how India's kind of international climate position has changed in the last 20 years. India is to first kind of look at it as basically as a diplomatic issue, and kind of in the Kyoto Protocol era, this is the era before the Paris Agreement era, and then moving closer towards Paris, say between 2008 and 2015, India has kind of successively developed national action plans where they have moved from this earlier position of common but differentiated responsibility, meaning that Western nations do more and much more. They have moved to the position of saying that it's going to be a co-benefits approach, where India will simultaneously, kind of pursue the aim of development, which means increased emissions, growth, because it's coal-based, in order to lift people out of poverty, and at the same time, kind of move towards cleaner renewable sources, so co-benefits approach. And at the Paris Summit, India actually, this is again, kind of voluntary reduction targets. India set its own targets of reducing greenhouse emissions intensity by 33-35%, above 2005 levels. And of course, coal is central to India's energy mix. And as of now, coal provides 60% of India's energy for electricity supplies. So while this was going on inside the tent, outside there were protests. Now, specifically, these protests were specifically about a spate of coal mining that's opening up in central India. I'll talk about the central Indian region, which kind of branches out across a few different states in a little while. But basically, the arguments coming from this camp are directly opposite to what the Indian government is saying. Indian government is saying that, yes, we need to continue mining and burning more coal. But here are communities or representatives of communities, of indigenous communities from central India, whose homes, whose forests, whose livelihoods, whose lands, and whose cultures are being upended for coal mining, new coal mining. These are not old coal mines, these are new coal mines that are opening up. So my point basically here is that, yes, there's this clear dichotomy between India kind of reaffirming the need to hold on to coal while doing other things inside the tent at Glasgow, whereas there are indigenous resistance movement people outside talking about the need to stop coal mining in their forest homes. Now, two of these are in direct conflict with one another, but this is not necessarily, again, the argument that Northern environmentalists make through the carbon environmentalism lens. So I'm going to work with these kind of contrasts through this presentation. So basically, I did go over this a little bit more in the previous slides. India actually typifies a global South, a large developing economy kind of position in terms of looking at climate justice as, the North needing to do more than the South. Whereas basically what has happened with civil society and its position on climate justice is that there was a strand of civil society which agreed with the Indian government's position in the Kyoto era, kind of from 1992 till 2005, in terms of the discrepancy between the emissions of the US versus India. And there were reports and arguments which framed civil society's position very strongly. Global Warming in an Unequal World by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan in 1991 was actually a direct contention to kind of claims made by US environmentalists about how, basically claims made by US environmentalists where they looked at the methane emissions from the cows of farmers in India, peasants, and equated that to, emissions coming from guzzling SUVs of a Texan. So they basically kind of pointed to what are the emission sources, what are the lifestyles of these people, and talked about global warming in an unequal world. But the thing is that I'm going to talk to this in a minute in the next slide. India's developmental turn from a closed economy, from a centralized kind of socialist economy, then opening up into kind of privatized development from the 2000s, kind of led to a rapid increase in carbon emissions. Rapid increase in coal mining and coal burning, kind of high growth rates. And that actually brought other arguments to the fore. And environmental justice advocates have since then called for domestic accountability for emissions. Greenpeace produced, I was in Greenpeace India around this time when we produced this report, and it was one of the ways that we, as an international organization, found credibility in the Indian civil society space, because we did tap into what is fundamental about justice and the fights for justice in India is about the disparity between the rich and the poor. And hiding behind the poor makes the case of the fact that the emissions of the most affluent 1% in India is 10 times higher than that of the negligible carbon footprint of 80% of India's poor, and that the Indian government is hiding behind the poor in terms of not taking responsibility for climate impacts, which is significant in India. So basically, there's a third strand in terms of how has coal mining, which had a lot of social legitimacy because of coal being the fuel that kind of fuels India's post-independence development. How has coal become delegitimized, and how has coal mining and the destruction of Adivasi homelands, which has been continuing, in the colonial era as well as the post-colonial, post-independence era, how has that finally become a critical human rights issue that all of civil society, kind of movements have started rallying around? I'm kind of going to quickly talk to that. So the Indian Constitution, safeguards indigenous, so in India's indigenous people are called Adivasis, Adi meaning native and Vasis meaning dwellers, so native dwellers of the land. The Indian constitution safeguards Adivasi lands. However, the litany of laws that constructed India's coal economy after independence gave preeminence to coal mining, even on Adivasi lands. So these are some of the ways in which Adivasi rights, although enshrined in the Indian constitution, have been trumped for coal mining, which was central to developing a newly independent nation. And overall, in the political economy of India from the 1950s up to the 1990s, it has been seen that Adivasi people have faced the worst brunt of developmental projects, dams, coal mines, thermal power plants, because although they constitute around 8% of the Indian population, 40% of Adivasi people have been displaced for large-scale developmental projects in that period of time. The first point here is the classic quote from our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, which he said to Adivasi people in central India, whose homes were going to be flooded for the biggest dam, the biggest reservoir coming up in the 1950s, the Sardar Sarovar Dam. And he said, if you must suffer, suffer for the greater common good of all. The greater common good of all actually epitomized the notion of the economy in what was India's socialist era. So it was not linked to the global economy in the way it is now. It was centralized, and coal was central to the development of this economy. So geographer Kuntala Lahiri Dutt has done extensive work on coal in India, and she has come up with various terms which are very key to trying to understand how, with the change in the economy, in the political economy, what coal has become from, kind of previously what it was. So I talked about the laws that built up a national economy of coal. From that, India transformed into when India started transforming into a more privatized economy, it started opening up various sectors to kind of, private companies for foreign direct investment. Coal, of course, coal and thermal power generation were one of the last ones to be opened up. However, what started happening was that private companies were able to, part by part, first start producing electricity, second, be able to mine thermal coal and sell it in the market. So what effectively ended up happening is that a whole set of legal instruments geared towards, making the state privilege coal mining, coal production over Adivasi rights, human rights, was then became available for the benefit of corporations. So moving from a greater common good, the idea of a tenuous argument, nevertheless, because it wasn't uniform greater common good. But moving from that, India moved to a place of legal eminence for coal still being there, while it is private gain that comes in. So this is the kind of the contradiction that came into the political economy. The other thing that happened after 2000 is that progressive legislations were also enacted. And this is kind of typically when I compare India and Australia, the global north and south in a way, I also see that this is at the time that extensive amounts of kind of resource extraction begins, is also a time whereas ameliorative measures, progressive laws are enacted to try and have some check and balance between human rights, land rights, indigenous rights versus extraction. So the introduction of land rights legislations that attempted to end the colonial legacy of land and forest ownership, which started under the British in India. So I'm going to particularly talk to the Forest Rights Act because that's central to what kind of went on it goes on in central India. The Forest Rights Act, enacted in 2006, which also came after a long 30-year march by civil society movements and Adivasi groups for basically rights for acknowledging the historical dispossession. So the preamble to the Forest Rights Act kind of basically acknowledges that Adivasis have not been adequately recognized in the consolidation of state forests during the colonial period and in independent India. And basically the Forest Rights Act allows communities to claim individual community forest rights over land, over forest land, that is theirs. And then be able to have a say in kind of extraction projects and coal mining projects. They can also veto. The village council can actually decide and have a referendum against mining. That's provision in the Forest Rights Act. So what's happened from 2005 to 2020, if you look at that period, what has progressively happened is that the changing political economy has kind of dismantled this tenuous notion of public good, and kind of because the private gain after neoliberalization has become amply clear. What has also happened is because these progressive rights have been put there and communities have become aware of them, the conflict between rights and resource extraction, primarily coal, but other resources, other minerals as well, has become very evident, where states have attempted to withhold rights, have attempted or taken away rights sometimes for resource extraction. The other part of this is the visibility that movements have started gaining, which they didn't have before, because of the focus of climate movements on resource extraction, on coal mining, on fossil fuel extraction. Those have provided pathways for internationalizing some of these movements. It's brought visibility and added layers of, kind of added platforms to talk about justice. The other part of the nature of the changing economy is that leading up to the Paris Agreement and around that, the global coal economy has been transforming. Globally, there is a withdrawal from coal. So what's happening is that new coal mines are being, and India is more linked to the global coal economy than it was before. So new coal mines are being pushed in, are being approved, despite economic unviability, despite the fact that coal might never be extracted, which is kind of leading to a corporate resource grab effectively, because the mines might never come in, but people lose their lands and their forest homes, and corporations gain land and resources and access to water and everything else that comes with it. The other telling factor, which is delegitimizing coal now, is that new coal mines are being pushed through by cracking down on civil society movements. So this is some of the characteristics of what's going on around coal in India at the moment. And I'm going to kind of talk to two case studies really quickly, because I want to kind of end soon, which kind of basically highlight all these elements. So Central India, the region that I'm talking about, is basically the central part of India. It covers a central part of 5 to 6 different states. And it is where the most number of India's Adivasi indigenous communities live on the land. And there are kind of layers in central India, which is, which need to be understood to understand the conflict that's going on over there. It is a coal-rich region. It's a mineral-rich region. And Adivasis have a history of colonial dispossession in central India and ongoing dispossessions as of now. It's also a place which has some of the thickest intact forests, and under the forests lie coal and minerals, and forests are the homes of Adivasi people living on the land. What has also happened is in the 10 years of the implementation of the Forest Rights Act since 2006, and then when surveys were done after 2016, it was found that only 3% of community forest rights had been granted in central India, which shows how governments have actively tried to either withhold rights from communities, not inform them or educate them about it, or actually in some cases take rights away, which I'm going to talk to in my case study. So kind of keeping that frame in mind for central India, I'm going to look at two regions, two places. So Mahan forests in the state of Madhya Pradesh, is the state of Madhya Pradesh. Mahan forest is right, if you can see the arrow over here, it's right to the eastern side. kind of at the edge of the Singrauli coal fields. Mahan Forests was my Indian case study for my thesis. So the community in Mahan Forests did not know about their forest rights, did not know that there was a new law that they could claim forest rights. And Greenpeace India worked with the community in Mahan and organized them over a long period of time. And the only process that you could work with in Central Indian communities like this is to focus on their rights. So the community got to know about their forest rights. They also got to know about what coal mining is doing to other places around them, because they are still in intact forests. Although at the edge of the coal field, they haven't seen the decimation that other areas have. So once they find out about the destruction that coal mining has caused region-wide, once they also find out that they have rights, because this is the interesting, well, it's interesting to us as researchers, but this is what it is. Communities think that the forests belong to the state because colonially the British took the forests away from indigenous people. They kind of cordoned the forests off and people couldn't access them to access forest produce for their livelihoods. So people still think that it is a state that owns the forest. It's not their forest. So the fact that there is the Forest Rights Act and the fact that the forests are theirs and they can claim community and individual forest rights is a fact that the state actively sometimes withholds. So civil society groups work with communities on the ground to make them aware of their rights. And the fact that they can actually, in a village referendum, say no to mining, that the act enshrines that. So Greenpeace worked with this community over a long period of time. And finally, the community decided that not only were they going to file for community rights, that they were also going to veto the coal mine. Because they wanted their forests to perpetuity and they wanted their customary forest economy. That's how they wanted to live. So the banner that they're holding up is after the coal mine was finally taken off limits, taken off the number of coal mines that were going to come up. There was a lot of political tussle around it. I'm not going to get into that story. But this banner that they hold up says democracy, long live democracy, which kind of basically indicates that rights are central to democracy on the ground in mining regions in India. In central India, people being able to exercise their rights, access their rights, is how they see democracy is asserted. The movement also had, through Greenpeace, the movement also had international channels. They were connected to Beyond Coal and other international movements. And basically, they brought those linkages to an international climate justice movement of how forests are central to Adivasi communities. And so they had pathways of talking about their struggle. The other, this is ongoing, and I talked about the Hasdeo forests in the beginning, where there were solidarity supporters of the resistance in Glasgow. So the Hasdeo forests are in the adjoining state of Chhattisgarh, adjoining the previous state of Madhya Pradesh. And the Hasdeo forests are the most intact, the thickest kind of linking corridor of forests in central India. The Hasdeo forests have been, because of the high quality of the forests, they have been off limits for coal mining for a long time. However, the previous government, not the Modi government, but the previous Congress government, the party that's in opposition now, just in their very last term, they opened up coal mining on the fringes of the Hasdeo forests, saying that this should be it. This is not, according to the science, this is not core forest area. This is still peripheral forest area. That's where it should remain. However, in the Modi era, coal mining is encroached into the heart of these thick forests. And a lot of the coal mining is being done by Adani. And we know now that Adani is one of the top 4 richest people in the world as of the last 2 weeks. And Adani's rise in the corporate sector has been, kind of paralleled by the rise of Narendra Modi in Indian politics. So that's another story for another day. So what's going on, and so what is the story of the Hasdeo forest is about the story of the last 2 years, last 10 years specifically. The story of Mahan is about the story from 2005 to 2015. What's happening with the Hasdeo forests is that the Indian government has started auctioning and selling coal mines in the Hasdeo forests as a post-COVID economic recovery. So a lot of these coal mines are going to be run and operated by Adani if they go ahead. However, there are others as well. So it's private coal mining development. So it's happening in the context, it is happening at a time when coal mining itself is becoming economically viable. And assessment after assessment shows that each of these mines might never come to a state of coal extraction. It's just resource grab that happens. It's also happening in violation of forest rights. So in the state of Chhattisgarh, this state where the Hasdeo forests are, the previous state government, not the current party in power, but the previous state government actually took forest rights given. Forest rights that were given were taken away from a community so that coal mining could go ahead. Now that there is not only is there no precedent for that, that's actually not legal. So while the case gets fought in the courts forever, the community is already being displaced for coal mining. So that's the story of the Hasdeo forest, which is an ongoing fight, and there's going to be a global day of solidarity very soon. So these are the women from a community in the Hasdeo forest who are hugging trees. Hugging trees is a method of resistance that kind of women in India have followed for hundreds of years. It was, of course, popularized by the Chipko movement from the 1970s. This was in the foothills of the Himalayas, where women went and hugged the trees to stop them from being felled. So this is the story of the Hasdeo forest. So my last two slides, and I'm going to end in 2 minutes, is about how do we bring this together then into key lessons and key learnings for a global climate justice movement. So not only are there, as Franklin said in the beginning, not only are there, there are differences in of themselves within the global South in terms of elite positions on climate justice versus indigenous and grassroots position on climate justice. But the focus, as someone who tries to link the central and the most vulnerable communities together into a matrix of justice, which should be centered in a climate justice movement, that's my aim. I look at this needing to be central. The central question that needs to be asked per se, and I am jumping the gun a little bit here because I really won't have time to get into renewables and details. But what emerges from the ground in India very clearly is that climate justice and researchers need to critically evaluate the questions they're asking. In the era of an energy transition, coal is actually on its way out. Renewables is also coming in. The question also is, are coal and renewables replicating the same mistakes on the ground? Are communities going to be disenfranchised and dispossessed for renewables like they have for coal? And I ask that question also very strongly because when I write my thesis, also partly through environmental history, I look at the waves of displacements that Indian communities have had for different kinds of energy. There's been displacements related to dams. Then they have been displaced for coal mines. Then they have been displaced for private coal mines. And now they might be displaced for renewables. So essentially, in terms of a global matrix of climate justice, which both northern environmentalists and southern elite environmentalists should be able to come around, the central question should be about what secures land, livelihoods, and culture for southern land-based communities. Of course, this is both northern and southern. Encounter, I put that phrase in the question. The additional points that need to come with it is, and these are the perils of carbon environmentalism. Carbon environmentalism is a term that's being used by activist scholars, and I haven't been able to find who, in terms of who first put it into academic literature. So I would assume it's one of those things that's been used in activism for a long time. It's being, scholars are writing it now, but it's something that cannot be attributed to one person because the idea has been there. So the carbon environmentalism specifically meaning a singular focus on basically moving from coal to renewables any which way, anyhow, and without focusing on the perils of the renewables technologies that you're talking about. The other, and actually I'm just going to talk to that first and come back. So what are some of the way, I mean, basically the focus needs to be in critiquing carbon, environmentalism, and needing to have a more holistic kind of outlook towards what is relevant and just in terms of renewables. Through a political economy lens, which is what I look at specifically, the economic model itself, who gains and who loses out. What are the scale of the projects? Very relevant for the Global South, because big projects, and I see this in Australia, on Indigenous land, there are massive solar projects. Indigenous people have asked for it to be there. They might or might not completely agree with the economic model, but they have called for those large-scale solar parks on their land. In India, scale is the biggest issue. And also, how is the state driving these projects? By disabling or enabling rights? How is the state responsible for exacerbating injustices and in driving the renewables projects? And carbon environmentalism actually exacerbates that process by giving the green tick to governments in the Global South to anyhow push renewables projects. So I'm just going to come back to this for a second. So along with that needs to be a robust critique of net zero, because that is the problem with carbon environmentalism, is there's absolutely no critique of net zero, which just basically lets off all governments, particularly global governments, from acting now. Not only does it do that, it gives the green tick to a whole suite of very risky futuristic technologies. So that's it for me. Thank you.